Hey guys, my name is Naguura and today we're going to do a 9.1 Moonkin Venthyr guide. So a lot of people have been switching to Venthyr since the 9.1 changes announced and with the new legendary Venthyr just being quite a bit stronger. So I'm going to do a quick guide to help you transition from the fairies to the vampires, and hopefully this makes playing Venthyr easier to you. So first I want to have a disclaimer as well to say that this is of course a guide in video form. So that means that I cannot change anything in case something updates with the Moonkin theory crafters, with the knowledge that we have about Venthyr, with changes or tuning that happens from Blizzard's side. So in case something does change with Venthyr, I cannot update this guide. But keep in mind that there's a Discord channel that you can join, the Dream Grove channel. I will list in the description below. You can always join there and see if anything changed. You can also join my stream at twitch.tv/Naguura and ask me anything in case something did change. The Covenant ability for Venthyr is called Ravenous Frenzy. Ravenous Frenzy is a 3-minute on-use cooldown that gives you 2% damage and healing per stack and 1% haste per stack as well for every ability you cast during those 20 seconds, and it stacks up. We will also play with the conduit called Endless Thirst, which additionally also gives you crit percent per stack. Depending on how high the conduit is, it gives you more or less crit percentage. So this is a really strong cooldown that basically just gives us more and more damage plus haste and crit the longer we have these cooldowns up and the more abilities we cast. There's also a downside to the cooldowns. Basically, if you're idling for 2 seconds, you will get stunned, you will take damage, and the effect also will end. This is of course incredibly important to play around, and any ability you cast will count as not idling, but movement does not count as not idling, and if you are stunned or hard to seat in any way, it doesn't count as idling either, so you don't have to worry about that. But of course you still don't want to get stunned or hard to seat while your cooldowns are up. Okay, so let's go over the Soulbinds. Our two relevant Soulbinds for Venthyr is Theotar and Nadia. Theotar will be our go-to Soulbind for raiding, with Nadia only being played if we cannot use Theotar's Soothing Shade properly, or if we can use Nadia's Thrillseeker perfectly throughout a fight. I will explain Soothing Shade and Thrillseeker now. Those are the most important Soulbind traits for each of those Soulbinds. So Soothing Shade is Theotar's first trait. It basically creates a shade, a circle around your character, and when you stand in within this shade, you will get a mastery buff for 12 seconds. If you walk out of it, it will be gone. Now, of course, depending on how much movement there is involved on a fight or in a situation, you might not be able to perfectly utilize this, but you should always try to stand in it as much as you can. And Thrillseeker is the first trait, Soulbind trait for Nadia. It will be really beneficial to play around Thrillseeker. The way it works is that it stacks up a buff on you whenever you're in combat. You gain stacks every 2 seconds, and whenever something dies around you, you will get 4 stacks. Once you hit 40 stacks, you will gain Euphoria, a haste buff. And then after Euphoria, you will also get Fatal Flaw, which is the last Soulbind of Nadia. So once you have that, you will get Fatal Flaw after your Euphoria buff, and that one gives you crit or haste depending on what your highest stat is. So it will be a pretty big haste buff into a pretty big crit or versatility buff, which is really, really beneficial for our cooldowns because they last so long. So we could fit both of those buffs in our cooldown window. But as I said, we do play Theotar as our go-to Soulbind because Theotar is just generally really strong. And even if you can play around Nadia perfectly, so you're able to use your cooldowns during those Euphoria/Fatal Flaw buffs, it's still not really too one-sided for Nadia. So that's why Theotar is our go-to Soulbind. Let's look at the Soulbind tree. For Theotar, you would just go for the 2 potency conduits. You're skipping the middle potency conduit because you want to go for the versatility buff. It's a pretty nice buff, the Soulbind trait, because it gives you versatility and also gives 4 people around you that are closest to you versatility as well. And that's just a really nice buff to have for your group and for your raid. So that's why you only go for 2 potency conduits in that tree. For Nadia, on the other hand, you go for 3 potencies because there's no other buff that would be too beneficial to skip the 3rd one. So you just go for Endless Thirst and Precise Alignment, and then you also add Fury of the Skies as the 3rd one for Nadia. With Theotar, you're just skipping that 3rd Fury of the Skies. Now, Precise Alignment has never really been played with Night Fae. The reason you play it with Venthyr is the fact that our cooldowns lasting longer is really beneficial when it comes to Ravenous Frenzy and Sinful Hysteria. That's our Covenant Legendary, I will explain later. Basically, our cooldowns are just really, really long. So if you're not playing Incarnation, having an extended Celestial Alignment really, really helps you to get your whole cooldown window, your whole Ravenous Frenzy window into your cooldowns. Without Precise Alignment, it's really hard to do, sometimes even impossible. Even with a low item level conduit on Precise Alignment, you won't be able to fit all of your cooldowns within CA. I'm going to talk about that later as well. So yeah, that's why that's a really good conduit to play for both Theatar and Nadia. Okay, quickly going over stats. Our best stats are going to be Mastery and Haste over Crit and Burst. But keep in mind that this is very, very like subjective depending on what your character's stats are. So you should always sim your character and not blindly go for certain stats because it's always depending on your character. There's no stat caps or anything like that. Just completely forget about that. Stat caps are just not a thing. So you should always sim your character and just always follow your sims. A general idea for the stats is that Mastery and Haste are better than Crit and Burst. Now let's talk about items. Of course, when it comes to legendaries, we're going to be playing Sinful Hysteria. That's our Covenant Legendary that will be unlocked once we have 48 renown. Sinful Hysteria basically extends our Ravenous Frenzy by a few seconds, adds 5 seconds of extra Ravenous Frenzy at the end, but we aren't gaining any more stacks during the last duration. Now for trinkets, ideally you want to use an unused trinket and a passive trinket. For unused trinkets, we still have Inscrutable Quantum Device and Instructor's Divine Bell that are our best trinkets. You can even combine those two trinkets for a really small gain. And the way you want to use it is you use your Quantum Device first and then your Divine Bell afterwards, after the 20 seconds are over. Because our cooldown window is so long, you will fit both of the trinkets into your cooldown window. Now, Imperial Ordinance would also be a good trinket. I personally wouldn't really recommend playing with it just because it's quite a bit complicated to min-max it, because our cooldowns are already requiring a lot of min-maxing when it comes to cooldown usage. So having another trinket that is additionally complicated because you have to use it on a boss and then there's travel time involved and then you have to wait for the buff to come back and make sure the buff is up at the very last second of... It's just complicated, so I wouldn't recommend running it unless you get it on a really high level from your vault. And all the rate unused trinkets are actually bad for us. They're all bad because we are a 3-minute class and most of them are 2 minutes, so they don't work for us. And for passive trinkets, there's Titanic Ocular Gland, which is really good, but keep in mind that it has a downside. If you're below 50% HP, it gives you anti-stats, and you don't want that to happen, of course. So whenever you're in a situation where you're below 50% a lot, you don't want to play this trinket. Then Forbidden Necromantic Tome is really good. Tome of Monstrous Constructions is good. Infinitely Divisible Ooze, Unbound Changeling, and Soul Cage Fragment, for example. There's also a lot of other trinkets that you could be using here. Just make sure you sim your characters depending on what trinkets you have and just decide from there. Now when it comes to Domination Sockets, I actually have some numbers here from the Moonkin Theory Crafters, but be very careful when looking at these numbers because it's very, very likely to still change. I highly assume that there's going to be tuning changes still. And another thing about Domination Sockets or Domination Shards is the fact that they are very situational. So all of these sims are 5-minute patchwork sims, which of course is not like a really realistic scenario. And these Domination Shards have very specific, unique effects that might be much better in other situations that are not 5-minute patchwork fights. But I'll show you the numbers anyway, just for you to get a general idea. So this is a pure single target sim. For pure single target, our best set would be the Chaos Bane set, then Bloodlink set second best, and the Winds of Winter set the third best. For the individual shards, the best shard would be Shard of Dis, the second best Shard of Back, and the third Shard of Core. But again, keep in mind this is full single target, so this is not really applicable on any fight that is not full single target. Just make sure you read the effects and then decide accordingly. Now let's go over talents real quick. We're still gonna go Nature's Balance as our go-to talent for raiding, and Force of Nature is our go-to talent for Mythic Plus, with Warrior Valoon being a situational talent for burst AoE, similar situations like Sire de Nathris. Might even see it used a lot more on like heavy AoE fights, maybe something like Kel'Thuzad. We're gonna have to see about that. Then all the other talents here in between are going to be utility talents, which is always dependent on your situation, so I'm not talking about those. We're going to go to the 40 level row. Our go-to single target talent is Incarnation, Chosen of Elune. That one is so good because our cooldowns are so important, and therefore having that extra damage during our cooldowns and them lasting longer is really beneficial to us. Starlord will be not a talent anymore basically for us. We're never going to play Starlord ever as a Venthyr, so you basically can just forget about that talent existing. For AoE, Soul of the Forest would be our go-to talent from 3 targets onwards. On 2 targets, Incarnation is still better. On 3, we would switch to Soul of the Forest. And then when we go to the next row, single target Stellar Flare will still be our go-to talent, while Stellar Drift will be our go-to AoE talent in raiding. And Twin Moons would be a situational consistent AoE talent. So if it's very, very consistent AoE, then Twin Moons would be probably the talent to go. But if it's more burst AoE that is required and more like not consistent AoE, then Stellar Drift would be our go-to. And that's almost always the case in raiding scenarios. So I believe that Stellar Drift will just be played on almost all of the bosses that are AoE in the raid. I don't think Twin Moons will actually be played in the raid, but we're gonna have to see once the raid is actually live and we can practice. Then for the last row, our best talent would be Fury of Elune. Fury of Elune is so good for Ravenous Frenzy because you can use it at the end of your cooldown window. So you're getting all of the astral power at the end to make sure you can dump a lot of Starsurges, and you also do all of the damage at the end. So Solstice and New Moon are basically just not being played as Venthyr. You just always play with Fury of Elune because Fury is the best for single target, and then it just gets better the more targets there are because of the cleave damage that it does. Right, so let's talk about our rotation real quick. Our damage graph throughout a single target fight ideally looks as follows. You can see how important our CDs are as Venthyr, so it's crucial to play your CD window correctly. You can see we're basically just doing almost all of our damage during our cooldowns, and then outside we're just doing tank DPS basically. Let's talk about the single target opener in a raid first. Now when it comes to the opener, this is only for raiding encounters. For everything else, you just do depending on what the situation currently is. For the purpose of this video, I actually pretended to be pulling a raid encounter. The difference between pulling a raid encounter and the target dummy is that my astral power doesn't reset when I get in combat, but if you get in combat with a raid boss, then your astral power resets to 50 if you have Nature's Balance, if you're above 50. So on this video, I'm actually overcapping astral power, but that's just for the purpose of the video to show what the opener would look like if I'm pulling a raid boss. So the way you open is going on max range, making sure you're not pre-pulling the boss. We are starting to cast Wrath, our first Wrath, between 3 and 4 seconds, depending on how much haste you have, as long as you're in max range. So you cast Wrath into Starfire, and then the boss should be pulled once you finish your Starfire. Then you apply all of your dots, Moonfire, Sunfire, and Stellar Flare. Then you use your cooldowns Incarnation plus Ravenous Frenzy, and then you cast Wrath 3 times into Starsurge. Again, keep in mind that I'm overcapping astral power here, but I wouldn't be overcapping if I would actually be pulling a raid boss. In any other situation, like using your cooldowns the second time on a raid boss or using your cooldowns on a single target fight in a plus or whatever, then you want to make sure that you use your cooldowns at 90 plus astral power. And you also want to make sure that your Fury of Elune will be up at the end of your Ravenous Frenzy window. So this is your priority list during your cooldowns. Make sure you keep your dots up, refresh them during the pandemic window. Then cast Wrath to fill. Cast Starsurge to not overcap astral power. Use your Trinket and Fury of Elune so that it will be up for the end of your CDs. And you also want to make sure you keep Sinful Hysteria in mind once you have that legendary. Now, I'm going to give you some examples here. For Fury of Elune, you should be using it approximately 9 seconds before Ravenous Frenzy ends if you don't have Sinful Hysteria. And with Sinful Hysteria, you should be using it at 4 seconds before Ravenous Frenzy ends, with the extra 5 seconds in mind that Sinful Hysteria adds. Now, unused trinkets also should be timed properly. For example, IQD, Inscrutable Quantum Device, lasts 20 seconds without Bloodlust. And if you use the trinket during Bloodlust, it will last 25 seconds. So without Sinful Hysteria, you can bind it into your CD macro. You can bind cooldowns, Ravenous Frenzy, trinket. But with Sinful Hysteria, you have to delay it because then your cooldowns last much longer than the trinket actually lasts. So you want to use it at 17 seconds remaining of Ravenous Frenzy if Bloodlust is up. And if Bloodlust is not up, you want to use it at 13 seconds remaining. Potion can be used with your CDs without Sinful Hysteria. So you can also bind your potion theoretically into your CDs if you don't have Sinful Hysteria. But once you do have it, you also want to delay your potion and use it at 17 seconds left of Ravenous Frenzy, at the same time as your Inscrutable Quantum device if Bloodlust is up. So theoretically, you could make a macro with IQD and Potion once Bloodlust is up. And if you use it outside of Bloodlust, then you would have to use separate bindings for it. Unfortunately, this will just require a lot of bindings because we cannot bind everything into one macro. Now, one thing I want to mention here real quick is that even if you don't min-max this, like even if you just bind everything into your cooldown macro, your potion and your trinkets and whatever, and you're not using it at the very end, even then Venthyr is really equal to Night Fae still. So even if you're not doing any of these min-maxing things, which understandably can become quite complicated, then Venthyr is still equal to Night Fae. So that's just something I wanted to mention real quick. Of course, if you're min-maxing everything perfectly, then you're gonna gain quite a bit of DPS and be quite a lot better than Night Fae. But if you cannot do that, or you just forget sometimes, or you just mess it up sometimes, then it's still decent damage. Spend all of your Astral Power at the end of your Ravenous Frenzy if you don't have Sinful Hysteria. And with Sinful Hysteria, you spend all of your Astral Power during the last 5 seconds during the Sinful Hysteria window. Now, this actually is pretty simple. If you can see, I'm basically just Starsurging before I'm overcapping and just like Wrath. Like I'm just like spamming Wrath, Starsurging, spamming Wrath, Starsurging until the very last few seconds of the cooldown, and then I'm dumping all of my Astral Power. Now, the only complicated thing during the cooldown window is that you need to find a moment where you can just stand still and cast all of this. And the other decently complicated thing is to also time everything perfectly with your trinkets and your Fury Balloon, because you always need to keep an eye on your weak aura where your Ravenous Frenzy is, and remember once use everything depending on the situation, right? Is Bloodlust up? Is Bloodlust not up? When do I use my potion? When do I use IQD? When do I use Fury Balloon? But once you get like a hang of it, it will be quite a bit easier. And also one thing that I'm going to be talking about more in detail later on is that if you run Stellar Drift, because it's like an AoE kind of fight, then you can also use Starfall within your cooldowns to be able to cast while moving if that is required, and you're not going to be losing that much DPS. I'm going to talk about it later though. So that's also a possibility. If you don't find a window where you can stand still 30 seconds and you're running Stellar Drift because the fight has some AoE, then you can just Starfall and still do a lot of damage, basically. A lot more than you would if you're just running around doing nothing. Now, in numbers, if you're running Soul of the Forest and Stellar Drift, so in like a full AoE kind of fight, then it's only a 1% DPS loss to Starfall on cooldown, even within your Ravenous Frenzy window, and outside as well. So basically you can just Starfall on cooldown and you will only lose 1% DPS. That's not a lot at all, considering that you gain all of this movement and mobility. If you run Incarnation, it's still only a 1% loss to cast Starfall on cooldown outside of your Ravenous Frenzy window, but inside your Ravenous Frenzy, it's more than a 1% DPS loss, so you should try and avoid it if you can, but you can still, of course, do it if you wouldn't be able to cast otherwise. But also keep in mind that Stellar Flare is, of course, still just a better single target talent for us to run. It's a 4% DPS gain to run Stellar Flare, so just keep that in mind, that you shouldn't just run Stellar Drift because you can. You should only run it if it's really an AoE situation or if you really have heavy movement involved. Now let's talk about AoE. For AoE, nothing really changed compared to Night Fae, or at least not that much changed compared to Night Fae. It sounds very complicated when I'm gonna go over this priority list, but in practice it's not as complicated as it sounds. Like, I'm just talking about a lot of numbers, number of targets, number of Astral Power you're gonna have, and so on. But the reason why I'm going over this is because there's very specific situations where people don't know what they're supposed to do, and then they can go over this list and see what they do. Once you know what you should do in each situation, then it will just come naturally to you. It will just be muscle memory at that point. But yeah, let's go over the list. So first of all, you want to keep Sunfire up at all times, as long as your targets live for another 10 seconds. And the amount of time is reduced per target hit. So if there's, of course, like 50 mobs, then you can refresh your Sunfire even if they're not going to live for 10 seconds. Now keep up Starfall all the time. Starfall on CD if you have Stellar Drift. Always enter Lunar Eclipse over Solar if you have the choice. Let's talk about when to apply Moonfires. So always apply Moonfires in Solar Eclipse if you can. Up to 10 targets, you will cast Moonfire, and even up to 20 targets if you have twin moons. Now, you apply Moonfire before lunar eclipse if there are 5 or less targets, all targets can be hit by Starfire, you will not lose Starfall uptime, and all targets live through the entire lunar eclipse. So if all of those requirements are met, then you Moonfire before you enter lunar eclipse. You refresh Moonfire during your lunar eclipse if there are 4 or 8 targets with twin moons, or less if they live through your next solar eclipse. Now, if that's not the case, and the requirements that I mentioned before are not the case either, well then what do? People always ask me, well, what do I do if I'm about to enter lunar eclipse? The requirements for moonfiring before lunar are not met, and the requirements for moonfiring during lunar are not met. Well, then you just don't apply moonfires. Then you just enter your lunar eclipse and you just Starfire, 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 Starfire. And then once you enter solar eclipse, then you can reevaluate if it's worth it to cast moonfires during your solar eclipse. Alright, so in solar eclipse you cast Wrath as a filler. You switch to Starfire if there are 6 or more targets, assuming they all get hit by your Starfire cleave. But always keep in mind that it's much more valuable to apply moonfires in solar eclipse. So only do this if you already have all moonfires up and you can just cast fillers because you have the free time, basically. Now, when it comes to Starsurge, you're Starsurging to prevent overcapping if Starfall isn't already up. If you're in lunar eclipse and there are 6 or more targets, then you would rather overcap Astral Power and cast Starfire instead. So only Starsurge to prevent overcapping if you're in solar eclipse, or you're in lunar eclipse and there are less than 6 targets. Before your cooldowns on AoE scenarios, if the mobs live for more than 35 seconds, after you have applied your moonfires, then you should be applying moonfires up to 8 targets or 16 targets with twin moons before you use your cooldowns. But keep in mind that this is like a really long time the mobs have to live for. If they have to live for 35 seconds plus the time it takes you to apply the moonfires, which is very unlikely unless you're doing really high M+. So at that point it would be worth it for you to apply it, otherwise it's not. Refresh Sunfire before you enter your cooldowns, so you don't have to refresh it multiple times during your cooldown window. And during your CDs, you refresh Sunfire during the pandemic window. You keep Starfall up at all times, or on CD if you have Stellar Drift, and try to time the last Starfall with Stellar Drift so that it will be up during the last 8 seconds of your cooldowns. Refresh Moonfire on up to 6 targets, 12 targets with twin moons, and when they will live for another 20 seconds. So if they don't live for another 20 seconds, then you just don't refresh the moonfires. For filler casts, I will link Jundar's weak aura below. It basically tells you which filler you should be casting, Wrath or Starfire, because it becomes actually quite a bit complicated depending on how much haste you have, how many targets are you hitting with your Starfire, because of the way Ravenous Frenzy works, because Wrath is a much quicker cast than Starfire is, so you want to cast Wrath at the start of your cooldowns, even if there's a lot of targets, just to get your Ravenous Frenzy stacks up higher. So that's not something we did with Night Fae. With Night Fae, we just always use Starfires if there's 2 or more targets. But with Ravenous Frenzy, the way the cooldowns work, we sometimes might want to Wrath even if there's a lot of targets there. So I really recommend just using that weak aura, and it kind of just tells you what to do. The one thing you want to note though is that the weak aura is not actually going to be correct if the mobs die while your cooldowns are still up, or if the mobs are spread out and they won't get hit by Starfire. Now, if the filler is Wrath, like if you're supposed to cast Wrath, or they're up to 5 targets, you should be using Starsurge to prevent overcapping, otherwise you just stop Starsurging. Okay, so now we're talking about min-maxing a little bit here. There's some tips and tricks I can give you. Keep in mind, all of this min-maxing is just like very small DPS gains, and you should only go for them if you're already like really comfortable with Venthyr, because if you try to go and min-max all of these things and then you just do it wrong, then you might be losing more DPS than you're gaining. So I really just recommend going into the min-max section once you are really comfortable with the normal rotation already. Alright, so first of all, refreshing dots outside of your eclipse during a pandemic window without running Solstice is actually a DPS gain. So if you're not running Solstice, which we don't really run, then reapplying your dots outside of your eclipse is a slight DPS gain on single target. Now, that's something that has not been the case as Night Fae. As Night Fae, we refresh our dots at the end of an eclipse. So this is a small change now that you can adapt to if you're comfortable with it. Now, with 150% haste or more, it's better to cast Starfire over Wrath on single target, but this will only happen if you have huge amounts of haste with PI and Bloodlust and whatnot. Now, without Incarnation, and a low enough precise alignment conduit. The precise alignment is what elongates your CA, your Celestial Alignment. It's actually better to use Ravenous Frenzy before Celestial Alignment to be able to line up the end of your cooldowns with Ravenous Frenzy. Because if you run Celestial Alignment and your Precise Alignment conduit is not big enough, then your whole Ravenous Frenzy plus Sinful Hysteria window will not fit into your cooldowns. So it would be better to use Ravenous Frenzy like 2 or 3 seconds before, depending on the item level of your conduit, and then use CAs a little bit after. Again, this is a small kind of DPS gain. I would say it's a decent amount of DPS, but you shouldn't be doing this if you're gonna mess it up. So this should be no longer than 2 or 3 seconds before you use your Celestial Alignment. Now, if the fight time allows it, you should be waiting for Euphoria/Fatal Flaw, the Nadia Soulbind, before using cooldowns, and this is relevant for 5 to 6 minute kill time. So if you want to perfectly use your cooldowns while running Nadia, then you should be using your CDs at 33 stacks of Thrill Seeker if you have Fatal Flaw. That's the last Soulbind. If you don't have Fatal Flaw, then you want to use your cooldowns at 37 stacks of Thrill Seeker to make sure your Euphoria/Fatal Flaw will line up with your cooldowns. You can actually see me using it in the video right here, where I'm just waiting for the stacks before I actually get my cooldowns out, and then I get the Euphoria plus Fatal Flaw perfectly into my cooldown window. Right, so if the fight allows it, you should wait for your potion to be up again. Your potion is a 5-minute cooldown, and your cooldowns are 3 minutes. So if there's a 6-minute fight where you can only use your cooldowns twice anyway, you can use it on pull and then one more time later on. So if that's going to be the case, then you can wait for your potion cooldown, because why wouldn't you, right? Unless there's some other thing that you want to keep in mind. Of course, if there's like an important phase in the fight at 4 minutes, then you want to use the cooldowns there. Or if your Bloodlust is not being used in pull, but rather like 4 or 5 minutes, then you want to use your cooldowns there as well, right? But otherwise, you do want to make sure you're saving your cooldowns for that second potion if you can, and there's no other gain to use it anywhere else. All right, so that's it about the Venthyr guide. I know that was a lot of information and a lot of like min-maxing thing and complicated things, but just keep in mind, even if you don't do any of this, even if you just use your cooldowns and just macro everything in it, then you're still going to be doing a decent amount of DPS. Also, just keep in mind that you're doing a lot less DPS outside of your cooldowns as we did with Night Fae. It's actually even a bigger gap. As Night Fae, we had a decent amount of damage outside of our cooldowns too because of Balance of All Things, but since we're running a legendary now that is enabling our cooldowns even more, so the legendary is basically not there outside of our 3-minute cooldowns, so therefore we're doing very little damage on single target outside of our cooldowns. But that's not always a bad thing, because that means that if there's a lot of movement involved outside of our cooldowns, it doesn't really matter, because we're doing so little damage outside of our cooldowns that movement is not really going to affect us that much. And as long as we find this window where we can use our 30 seconds of cooldowns, then we're going to be golden, right? So just really try and find this 30 seconds window in the boss fight to be able to use your cooldowns. Just play really good for those 30 seconds, get those cooldowns out, and then we can just, we can just chill and do whatever, just watch a Netflix show on the second screen or whatever, and then we're gonna be fun. So yeah, I hope this really helped you out. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Remember to go over and watch my stream at twitch.tv/Naguura if you have any questions. You can also ask questions below in the comments if you want to. If I finally will get to answer some of them, because there have been lots of questions and I've been a bit busy, but I will try to do my best with answering questions. And also make sure you join the Dream Growth channel and look at the pins, look at the FAQs, ask questions there, and look for updates. And of course, annoy the people there, because the moderators, they're all really toxic and mean, so definitely make sure you annoy them with questions and say things like, but Naguura said, but Naguura did this, but Naguura... Keep doing that. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!